Okay, so we should be good now. All right, so what we're looking at today, so this is your last unit for this semester, right? So there's 3 more chapters. We're basically looking at the build up to the Civil War. We'll have a chapter on the Civil War itself, and then we'll have 1 chapter on Reconstruction, which is sort of how we attempt to deal with the fallout of the Civil War. Perhaps you realize at this point that we have not dealt with the fallout of the Civil War, not in 140, 60, 160 years. I don't know, however long it's been. We have not dealt with the fallout of the Civil War by any point in time. Okay, so obviously the elephant in the room for the entirety of the first basically 100 years of existence of the United States is slavery. Right? Again, we talked about conceptually how the founders thought slavery was wrong, right? The founders believed that slavery was sort of a necessary evil at the time. And so they saw slavery as being something that would, I think most of the founders believed it was something that would basically like end itself, right? So the expansion of the United States then creates some significant issues, because as the U.S. is expanding in territory, and as the U.S. is creating more states and more territories, the slavery issue becomes a prominent issue. There's a piece of legislation, it's the Wilmot Proviso, that is actually aimed at trying to limit slavery in new territories. It's passed during Zachary Taylor's presidency, and Taylor is actually a slave holder himself, but he doesn't veto the Wilmot Proviso, right? He's not going to do anything about that sort of issue. Instead, ultimately, what we get is the idea of popular sovereignty, and popular sovereignty is the idea that there we go. Popular sovereignty is the idea that these new territories are going to be able to self-determine as to whether or not slavery is or is not permissible within those states. And I need you to understand that this is because it's been a continuing sort of ongoing battle, right? Like we had the Compromise of 1820, right? And then we had the Missouri Compromise that basically said you could have slaves like south of this line, but you can't have slaves north of this line. So the idea is sort of, what are you going to do with all of this? But then it also becomes wildly problematic, because if you have popular sovereignty, what happens to a slave owner who moves into a territory, brings their slaves to the territory, only to have the territory then vote via democracy, via popular sovereignty, to outlaw slavery, right? What happens at that point? And which is a very interesting sort of legal question. And if you understand sort of the law, we do have something called ex post facto laws, which basically means that if it's legal at the time, it needs to remain legal, right? Or it can't be illegal for you at that point. So then there comes the question, right? Like, you already own slaves were in the territory hadn't decided one way or the other. Now all of a sudden, what happens to those slaves? Are those slaves free? Do those slaves get their freedom? Is that slave owner afforded the opportunity to again move somewhere else and allow the practice of slavery to continue? And so slavery is a very, very contentious issue. It actually gives rise to a political party, the Free Soil Movement, the Free Soil Party. They are looking to prevent slavery from expanding into new territories. Okay? That becomes a bigger issue with the California Gold Rush, just because the California Gold Rush, which happens basically at the end of the 1840s, right? You see a massive, massive expansion in population in California. That massive population expansion in California leads to California statehood. And California statehood then begs the question, well, what are we going to do about the slavery issue, right? How are we going to rectify this? What you need to understand and is up until this point, so basically from sort of the founding, right, or really let's say like 1808 or whenever it was that slavery really became a contentious issue, right? Up until like 1850, the Senate had maintained a balance. So there was a balance in the Senate between the number of slave states and the number of free states. And since the Senate is based upon equal representation, that means you had an equal number of slave-owning senators as you did non-slave-owning senators, which would have prevented basically anything from being accomplished as it pertains to slavery. And so now all of a sudden, California is going to be admitted. We don't really have another state that we can admit at the same time in order to try to maintain that balance of power. And so now the question is, how do we deal with that? And as far as the sort of statehood of California goes, and I do need you to understand that first, the California gold mines are actually found in like Central California, right? So sort of in the Central Valley area. Most people go to California in order to try to strike it rich. I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about westward expansion already, right? Like Americans are constantly looking at like get rich quick schemes, right? Like that's all Americans want. They just want to try to get rich quick without like any actual work. Gold rushes allow for that all the time, right? Because you go out and you happen to buy the right plot, and all of a sudden, if you find gold on your land, like you are filthy rich the next day. And I mean filthy rich. I think I told you if there's ever like a gold rush again, like you know what to do, right? What do you do? Correct. Go move there and open up like your own little tiny Walmart, because there won't be a Walmart there, right? And then all you got to do is sell like pickaxes and shovels and like sifting pans and things like that, because everybody's going to come out there trying to get rich, and they're all going to buy all their stuff from you, and then you get rich. And you won't be the richest. Like, don't get me wrong. Like the 1% of the people there that actually find gold, they will be way wealthier than you, right? But 99% of the people that go there looking for gold, they will be broke, and you will have taken their money, and you will be rich, and they will be crying, all right? You also need to understand that within California, there's a significant percentage of Chinese people that have moved in. And again, we've sort of talked about rises and sort of ebbs and flows in nativism up to this point. You're going to have more of this. You're going to have more issues with nativism now, though, instead of it being in relation to, the Irish or the Italians or, Eastern Europeans or Jews or whoever it was along the East Coast. Now along the West Coast, we're going to have some issues with the Chinese and whether or not the Chinese are welcome, how we're going to deal with them as a group, right? So Henry Clay is a name that you should recognize, right? Clay plays a role in the Missouri Compromise. He is a Kentuckian. What are people from Kentucky called? I have no idea. He's from Kentucky, right? He's been a relatively prominent politician for a long time now in America. He's actually one of the prouder, or sorry, not prouder, more popular politicians. He's been in the running for president of the United States, but he's going to outline this sort of great compromise from the floor of the Senate, where he's trying to prevent the union from tearing itself apart, which is, again, I mean, we know now because we understand history, it's inevitable, right? The reality is it was probably an inevitability then. So Clay is basically trying to work toward a compromise in a manner of trying to placate or appease both free states and slave states, right? So it ends up being a whole bunch of different resolutions that are all sort of packed in together. So, for instance, one part of it is California is going to become a free state. New Mexico and Utah would become slaveless territories. Texas's claims of New Mexico wouldn't be recognized. Texas would be compensated for that sort of loss of land. Slavery would continue in the capital, in D.C., although the trading of slaves within the capital would be prohibited. We would create the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act basically made it a crime to harbor slaves, to not turn slaves over. So, I mean, like the Fugitive Slave Act, I mean, obviously, in addition to obviously going after the slaves that were trying to escape, that were fugitives, it also created heavy penalties on abolitionists and members of the Underground Railroad and those people that might aid the slaves that are trying to escape to freedom, right? The Fugitive Slave Act actually creates sort of more incentive for freed slaves to try to get all the way up into Canada rather than into the northern United States. Because you had, with the Fugitive Slave Act, you had these sort of slave bounty hunters that would be roaming around in the north. And if they found a black person, like they could find a freed black person, right? And then they would be like, you're an escaped slave. And that dude would be like, I've never been a slave my whole life. Like, I was born free. I was born in New York. Like, I've never been a slave. And they're like, nope, you an escaped slave. And then they would basically arrest you and drag you back to the South and just sell you into slavery. Like, pretty horrific. And with all of this, I mean, Congress kind of turns a blind eye, and Congress isn't going to get involved with interstate slave trading. Because I think I've already mentioned this to you as well, right? As cotton became king down in the deep South, we had some of our less profitable agricultural states like Virginia or North Carolina, although Virginia was probably the most notorious, and it essentially breeding slaves in order to sell those slaves downriver into the deep South, into Mississippi and Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, so that they could go work on cotton plantations where labor was a little bit more in need. So all of this obviously creates great debate. And a lot of this comes to a head. So Zachary Taylor's going to die in office. Millard Fillmore becomes president. And it allows for a little bit more concession. Fillmore is a little bit more agreeable than what Taylor was on a number of these issues. So the Fugitive Slave Act, though, ultimately becomes the biggest two issues out of this that you need to understand. California is granted statehood, and the Fugitive Slave Act goes into effect, again, sort of drastically changing the the sort of lives of Black people all throughout the North. Prior to the Fugitive Slave Act, if you were a Black person in the North, you were free. Like if you were an escaped slave and you made it all the way to the North, you're free, right? Like there weren't people wandering around being like, let me see your papers, right? Let me see your papers saying that you're a freedman, right? Which is the term that comes out for that. And now all of a sudden, Black people, even in the North, are sort of living in constant fear that they might be rounded up and sent back down south. And so this is all obviously in the late 1840s. Then we're going to get the Compromise of 1850. Again, it's an attempt to help sustain the Union and sustain what is going on. Stephen A. Douglas is a senator from Illinois who's basically trying to figure out how to make Clay's compromises actually work, actually be feasible. And so ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 is what we refer to as what Clay was attempting to enact, right? So California gets their statehood as a free state. New Mexico becomes a territory. Again, this is sort of whoops, let me move that for you. So this is sort of what we get, right? Like California is a free state in 1850. Texas cedes. You need to understand, like all this used to be Texas, right? Like Texas used to be enormous, but Texas is going to cede all of this land here, and it's going to be compensated for it financially. And you do have the Missouri Compromise line right there, 3630. But ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 is going to delay. Obviously, we have the Civil War. You can't say that it prevents the Civil War. That certainly is an inaccuracy. But it at least delays it. And the reality is we spent decades in American history basically trying to put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, just trying to control the bleeding and get on to the next day. Obviously, if you understand sort of the metaphor, if you don't treat the wound, the Band-Aid is eventually not going to be able to hold it together and help. So this is like a flyer as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? So if you can read this, and I don't generally read things to you, but right, colored people of Boston, you are hereby respectfully cautioned to avoid watchmen and police officers. Like Black people now have to, like you can't go to the cops for help anymore, okay? Because the cops might be slave catchers, which are ultimately kidnappers, right? So they can catch you, kidnap you, take away your freedom, your liberty, and take you back and take you down to the South and sell you into slavery, even though you were not a slave, right? And obviously this is abolitionists sort of condemn this. There are parts of the North where it's really not enforced. But by the same token, right, like if you have an area like Boston, Boston might not have been enforcing it themselves, right? Boston might not have been rounding up people. Obviously, this says order the mayor and aldermen, they're allowed to, again, sort of catch you. But even in the areas where it didn't, like the local government wasn't necessarily in favor of it, your bounty hunters, your slave catchers, they had federal law on their side, right? The Fugitive Slave Act would supersede any local enforcement, right? I want you to think about it, to try to put this into sort of today's perspective for you, right? You know, we have like sanctuary cities, right? You know what those are? No. So sanctuary cities are places like San Francisco. If you are an illegal immigrant in San Francisco and you get arrested, San Francisco will not turn you over to ICE, right? Which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Okay? They're not going to turn you over, even if they like run your paperwork and realize you were an illegal immigrant. Okay? On the other hand, if an ICE officer goes into like a San Francisco police department and is like, I want this prisoner, the San Francisco police have to turn him over because federal law supersedes state law. And you'll learn that next year. It's something called the Supremacy Clause. When local law or state law is in contradiction to national law wins. So your slave catchers, right, your little bounty hunters that were going up, okay, they could go and basically take, under federal law, somebody, even if the local government was trying to protect them. Uncle Tom's Cabin is written in part as sort of a response to the Fugitive Slave Act and a lot of what was going on at the time. Harriet Beecher Stowe is the author. She's a little white woman from, memory serves, Connecticut, who didn't actually really have a lot of experience with slavery. But she writes this novel that sort of shows, even though obviously it's fiction, it does show the harsh realities of slavery within the United States. The election of 1852, Franklin Pierce is running. He is running in sort of promotion of sort of maintaining the status quo and westward expansion. Pierce is elected, although ultimately Pierce is probably one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Fairly deeply flawed individual. He's running against Winfield Scott, who is a general under the Whig campaigns. He's a military man. He doesn't really understand politics. In fact, Scott will end up sort of failing to understand the political climate, even in the midst of the Civil War itself, which is ultimately sort of detrimental to his military career. But he was grossly sort of outmatched in terms of political understanding. Pierce is fairly adept politically, and he also Pierce has some people advocating for him that make him look a lot better than what he was. There's a book that comes out prior to the election that's a biography, and I use air quotes when I say biography of Pierce, because it would be like the biography of Al Gore saying Al Gore invented the internet and like climate change. Like Al Gore didn't invent anything, but it's essentially people just taking credit for a whole bunch of stuff that they weren't able to do. Kansas-Nebraska crisis, as westward expansion is continuing, this is a significant issue, just because we're still not sure, or we're still struggling to understand what is a free state, what is a slave state. You end up with attempts at trying to create the Transcontinental Railroad that's meant to aid the unity of the continent, right? So obviously California has become a state, right? And if we go back a few slides and you look at that map, or actually let's just go forward a slide again, and you sort of look at this map, right? Like California has become a state, and then you have all of this just sort of vast, open, for the most part, unsettled territory at the time, right? And so there's a whole bunch of concern as to how are you going to organize that, and what are you going to do with it? Because we need California to be able to engage in commerce with the rest of our population centers, so that transcontinental railroad is ultimately very, very important, right? It's a way of trying to unify the nation. But I also need you to understand, again, if we go back and look at this map, right? Do we know where the transcontinental railroad goes? Do y'all actually notice? Where? What city to what city today? San Francisco to New York. Hey, basically San Francisco to New York. And how do you think the South felt about that? Oh, see, this is another problem, right? This is another problem, because now you're creating a transcontinental railroad that is unifying the North, not the South, okay? Again, also with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have this issue of bleeding Kansas, right? And the issue of whether or not Kansas is going to become a slave state. There's actually a couple of decent Civil War movies that sort of deal with Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri type area, and how it interacted and how it dealt with the issue of slavery and the issue of sort of popular sovereignty and whatnot. Ultimately, you have the emergence of a Republican Party. That Republican Party is a new party, sort of born out of the Whigs, who don't last very long, and the Free Soil Party, and so they're advocating for a free Kansas. And again, Kansas is one of those territories where ultimately popular sovereignty was going to dictate whether or not Kansas was a free state or a slave state. Okay. Ultimately, what ends up happening, and maybe this will surprise you, maybe it won't, right? And when they had the vote in Kansas, anybody want to guess what happened? What do you think Donald Trump thought about the vote in Kansas? Fraud. It was massive fraud. Absolutely massive fraud, right? You had all kinds of people just kind of like traveling to Kansas and casting votes in Kansas that were not from Kansas. And so the massive number of fraud, the massive amount of fraud, in that basically ignites some warfare within that territory, which is where you get bleeding Kansas coming from as an ideology. It gets so bad that you have the entirety of the United States basically on edge, ready to snap over the least little things. It makes its way all the way to the floor of the Senate. And so Charles Sumner gives a speech on the crimes against Kansas, and he singles out Andrew Butler from South Carolina as sort of this terrible person, because he's a slaveholder and he's a South Carolinian, and ultimately, the very fact that you're singling this person out led to some violence on the floor of the Senate, because while Butler wasn't there, Preston Brooks was Butler's, I think it was nephew, and he was a congressman, representative, basically goes onto the floor of the Senate in order to defend his uncle's honor and beats Sumter like within an inch of his life on the floor of the Senate. Like, I need you to understand, like, dude takes a cane into the floor of the Senate and starts beating another man. Right? Like, that's like you chuckle and you laugh, but that's how contentious the United States is at this point, right? Like, that's how problematic it is, right? Everything is coming to a head and everything is beginning to boil over because we've allowed basically this wound of slavery to fester pretty much forever. In the election of 1856, you have three candidates running. So Buchanan is your Democrat, Fremont is your Republican, and then Millard Fillmore, who was president at the time, is your know-nothing party. Obviously, Buchanan becomes successful, but it does sort of launch the Republican Party onto a national platform, right? Again, I want you to sort of pay attention. The Republicans are winning the North, basically, right? The Democrats are winning the South. And so this sets up what will be the future of sort of Republican versus Democrat throughout like the remainder of political history. So we had some deepening sectional issues. Again, this is sort of recurring, right? Like there's a massive issue. We're not really doing anything about it. It's creating a bigger divide. Again, you go back and you look and you notice, I mean, all of your slave states are all voting together, right? All of your slave states are voting for the Democrat. Most of your free states are voting for the Republican. And the Panic of 1857 is an economic panic in which Buchanan's ultimately like a do-nothing president. Buchanan does so little that there's a wide-held belief that had Buchanan been president of the United States during the Civil War, he would have simply allowed the South to secede, to leave. We would have two different countries today, but we're not for the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the reality is the South secedes in large part because of the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? So, I mean, maybe if Buchanan was still there, the South wouldn't have chosen to wouldn't have chosen to leave. The Dred Scott case is obviously problematic as well. So just so you understand, Scott was a slave taken to a free territory, lives there for a while, and ultimately he sues on the grounds that because he was in a free territory and there's no slavery there, once he was brought there, he should have been granted his freedom. The decision of the Dred Scott case is absolutely horrific in terms of like American history. And because the Supreme Court didn't say Dred Scott had to remain a slave. That wasn't the decision. Like, that was the implication, or that was the outcome of the case. But that's not what the Supreme Court actually said. What the Supreme Court actually said in the Dred Scott case was significantly worse than, hey, no, your master took you there and then he brought you back to Missouri and you're still a slave. The Supreme Court said you're not a man. You're not a person. You can't sue. You don't have any legal recourse. We can't even hear this case because you're not a man, because you are not a citizen, because you are not a human being. You don't have standing before the court in order to sue. They essentially equated Dred Scott to your refrigerator, right? Your refrigerator can't sue you. That's how horrific the outcome of that case is. Ultimately, you end up with sort of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which does become sort of prominent in terms of American political history. Just because the Lincoln-Douglas debates are theoretically the beginning of what you see in political debates today. Again, as a result of some of these crises as it pertains to slavery, you do have skirmishes that arise. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry is always a good example. Brown is a sort of religious zealot, who believes that he's sort of morally correct to fight against slavery. He storms what do they call them? Like an armory, right? Like an outpost, a national armory, and sort of militarizes his own militia or his own army, whatever you want to call it, in order to fight against slavery. And ultimately, Robert E. Lee and the Virginia Army are the ones that come out and put him down. Northerners and abolitionists, they love John Brown. They think John Brown is a hero. They think that he is a martyr. The South is obviously terrified. The South views him basically as a terrorist, right? And you need to realize, like, I need you to understand that when two people in the United States can basically look at the same guy and be like, I think this dude is a hero, and the other person says, I think this dude is a terrorist, that is a divide that is almost insurmountable, okay? Because you cannot have two people within the same nation that have that vastly different opinion of an individual. But ultimately, that's sort of what John Brown represents. Again, the election of Lincoln is ultimately sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. You had a bunch of states sort of hinting that they would leave if Lincoln were to be elected. And I want you to understand, I mean, Lincoln is no lover of Black people. The reality is Lincoln is probably as racist as everybody else at the time. You could despise slavery, and Lincoln does despise slavery, without loving Black people, or without even believing that Black people are really your equals. And so I need you to understand that concept. Like, don't run around and be, yay, Lincoln loved the Black people. First of all, you understand, like, the Emancipation Proclamation, which ends slavery, doesn't end slavery. Okay? Like, Lincoln doesn't end slavery, right? Slavery is ended after Lincoln's death. Slavery is ended through the 13th Amendment, not through some behavior of Lincoln, right? Lincoln basically, I mean, in one of the debates, Lincoln makes the argument, these people are talking about the panic of 1857 and the economic crisis and their inability to find a job. And Lincoln basically tells them that if they want to go south, right, if they want to cross the border into Missouri or into Kentucky, he knows of a bunch of jobs that they could find. They probably just wouldn't like the working conditions, right? Speaking to slavery, okay? He sees it as sort of morally reprehensible, but ultimately Lincoln gets the Republican nomination, and then Lincoln will obviously win the election in 1860. Again, we do have sort of multiple states at the time. But again, I want you to look at this and just sort of see the vast difference sort of regionally in terms of where the votes are coming from. But I also want you to understand, when you look, like, there's 35 electoral college votes in New York, 27 in Pennsylvania, 23 in Ohio, right? Florida's got 3, Georgia 10, Texas 4. Your your southern states have vastly lower population. And so it's a north versus south issue, right? Buchanan basically had done nothing. And once Lincoln is inaugurated, that's the end of the waiting game. South Carolina is going to try to take over Fort Sumter. And even though no shots are fired at that point, I mean, that is the beginning of the Civil War as a direct result of Lincoln's inauguration and a direct result of an electoral map that looks like this. So that's going to get us to the end of this chapter. That's going to get us to the beginning of the Civil War itself, which will be your next chapter. Y'all should have a quiz tonight, correct? Oh, it's tomorrow night? Wonderful. Well, I don't actually need to lecture today. That's okay. Oh, did I really make a quiz due Friday night? That is mean of me. You know what? There's no response due this week. We're going to move Friday's quiz up until we'll move it up to Thursday. Wait. Did I release your quizzes on the day they're due, or can you do them early? You can do them early, can't you? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do then. I'll lecture on Thursday again, okay? And then I would advise you to do the quiz on Thursday, but I'm not going to change the official due date, all right? Does that work? Wonderful. All right, thanks, guys.